A man named Pat is climbing a mountain. As he climbs, he realizes he has reached a summit and finds a cave to wait out the storm as the wind starts to pick up speed. Settled inside the cave, he writes in his journal, sharing his desire to make some permanent changes in his life. Just then, his friend walks in. Pat welcomes him, commenting that he was waiting for him to join, and suggests they rest there until the storm passes. As Pat turns to get food from his bag to offer his friend, the man suddenly attacks him with an ice pick, instantly murdering him. A couple of years later, a woman pilot in a red parka looks up at the sky as another plane lands. A man steps out of the plane. Another woman, Mayor Hop, is there to pick him up. She introduces herself and welcomes the man, Nate, to the town of Lunacy. As she shakes hands with him, she notices his boots and comments sarcastically, as they are wrong for Alaskan snow weather. Nate is suddenly hit by the cold, and comments on it. She jokingly informs him that this is balmy weather by Alaska standards. Furthermore, she tells him that she will get him situated in town. Since the next day is New Year's Eve, he might need to finish his necessary shopping, as the town will be shut the following day. As they walk to her truck, Nate spots the other woman, the pilot, tying down her plane to a notch post in the snow. Their eyes meet and she smiles at him. Nate is instantly struck by her beautiful smile, and looks back again after putting away his bags, but finds her gone. Nate and Mayor Hop arrive in the town. She takes him to the only inn there. When they are walking up the steps, a man named Bing walks out. The mayor calls out to him, asking if he is still not speaking to her, but he ignores her. She introduces Nate to him, which makes him stop and turn. Bing calls Nate Chichaco, a slang word for an outsider, and gives him a beady-eyed look. The mayor explains to Nate that Bing wanted his job, to be the chief of police for Lunacy. She also warns him that there are others apart from Bing who also want this job, and may hold grudges against him. As they enter the inn, she takes him up the stairs to his room. On the way, they are interrupted by a woman, the inn's owner Charlene, who asks after him. The mayor quips at her to hold off hitting on Nate until he is settled. Nate is surprised by the exchange. The mayor explains how Charlene is known to be promiscuous in her dealings with men, especially in a small town like Lunacy. In his room, she hands him his chief of police badge and points out that in small towns, people are very curious about newcomers, and may ask him questions about why he chose to leave Boston. However, he is not obliged to share with anyone. After she leaves, Nate looks out of his room window and spots the woman in the red parka again, but she disappears inside a building. A little while later, he steps out and walks to the police station. When he enters, he introduces himself to the deputy Otto, who also comments on his boots. Looking at the deputy's gruff manner of greeting, Nate figures that he too wanted his job but was rejected. The deputy confirms this. The phone rings, and the deputy answers. Nate inquires about the call, to which he replies, Mac Brothers, and asks him to tag along. When they arrive at the inn, they find two brothers fighting over which is the better Jackie Chan movie. Nate is taken aback at the reason for the fight and he threatens to arrest them, surprising everyone, including Charlene, John, a teacher and one of Charlene's admirers, and even Otto. As Nate holds back one of the brothers, he spots the woman in the red parka again. She looks at him, smiles, and walks away. The brother calms down, worried about being arrested. At everybody's insistence, Nate decides to let them off, on the condition that they pay $100 to Charlene for the damages. At the New Year's party the next day, Nate comes down to the inn, where he finds everyone celebrating. He attempts to quietly slip away when he is stopped by a man who introduces himself as Max, a reporter with The Lunatic, the town's weekly newspaper, and introduces him to other town council members, Ed and Bing. Nate feels the undercurrents of resentment from Ed and Bing, and his doubts are confirmed when Ed comments on how having a full-time chief seems like a waste of money to him. Nate takes the comment at face value, and does not get offended. It's then that Max points out that Ed also happens to be the president of the town's bank, and is very stingy. Max tries to divert the conversation away from solemn topics, and introduces Nate to his wife. They are then joined by the mayor, who taunts Ed and tells Nate that Ed still resents her for being the mayor, to which Ed takes offense, and clarifies that he just does not agree with some of her decisions. Max asks Nate for an interview someday, but he politely refuses. Undeterred, Max asks him about getting shot a year ago. The mayor pulls him away and apologizes to him for Max's exuberance. She shares that him being the only new thing in town is making everyone act like that. She points to John, and explains that despite living in Lunacy for more than 20 years, the locals still think of him as an outsider, so Nate can guess how rare his presence is. She goes away to get him a drink when he spots the woman in the red parka again. This time, determined to meet her, he goes looking and finds her by the bar. She introduces herself as Meg, and just as they start talking, she also notices his boots and compliments them. Nate finally asks her why everyone is commenting on his boots. She explains that it's because they won't last in the Alaskan cold. As they chat, Charlene walks up and tries to pull Nate to the dance floor. He asks for a minute to finish speaking to Meg, but Charlene blithely disregards it. Meg gets furious and walks off, leaving Charlene calling after her, much to Nate's surprise. He is still standing there, confused about what just happened, when Mayor Hop returns and explains that Meg is Charlene's daughter, and they had issues after Meg's father Pat left them. Nate wonders about Meg and walks outside looking for her. He finds her drinking alone in the cold. He joins her and they talk about Meg's sad history, which she feels everyone in town must have told Nate about. However, when they start asking more personal questions of each other, both step back and move toward more casual conversation. Just then the northern lights appear, and Meg points them out to Nate. He is awed by them. Meg shares a myth associated with them, believing that some think they come from the afterlife. Essentially, the belief is that the ancestors are trying to make contact. They hear the others chanting the New Year countdown inside. Meg kisses Nate to ring in the new year. Nate is a little surprised, and she laughs, mentioning that she thought he would be fun. Nate tries to defend himself, but just then they hear a shot, and Nate has to leave to check it out. The next day Nate walks into the station, and they receive news about 2 kids being stuck outside on No Name Mountain. Otto explains to Nate that, due to the weather, the kids will freeze out there unless they are brought down. He sends Nate to Meg, as she can fly him up and help rescue the kids. When he arrives at Meg's, her dog jumps at him, barking furiously until Meg pulls him off. He explains the situation, she readily agrees, and they take off. While flying, they discuss why they each chose their professions. Meg shares that she enjoys looking at the sky and the possibilities, influenced by her father. This inspiration led her to become a pilot. In contrast, Nate shares that he became a cop because of his love for rules, which elicits laughter from Meg. As they spot the kids, Nate descends to reach them while Meg looks for a place to land. When Nate reaches one of the kids, he inquires about the other, and that's when he learns about the discovery of a corpse in the cave. They hastily return to the cave, where they find Pat's frozen body. Back on land, as Meg ties off the plane, Nate tries to speak to her. However, she is clearly in shock and upset, so she lashes out at him, yelling about how he could never understand what she is feeling. Her father looked the same as Nate did 15 years ago, and that means he never abandoned her. Nate quietly asks her to stop blaming him, but she corrects his misconception. She shares that she actually blamed Charlene all these years, and now needs to break the news to her. Nate heads to the office to find the state sergeant waiting for him to hand over the body. Nate tries to explain that it could be a homicide, and the murderer could be local, but the sergeant points out that he is no longer a detective, and the case is not his. Nate reluctantly hands over the papers. Meg finds Charlene playing cards with John. She asks to speak with her alone, and John leaves. Meg breaks the news to Charlene about finding his body with an ice pick stuck in his chest. Charlene is devastated. She falls apart, thinking about all the rumors of him being seen with other women, about thinking he abandoned them. Meg is unable to see her like that and rushes away, even as Charlene tries to call her back. The townsfolk gather for his wake, but Meg does not attend. Nate notices Max being very broken up about it, and asks John if he and Pat were close. John shares that no one was close to Pat. Nate further inquires about Charlene, to which John initially resists answering. But at Nate's prodding, he shares that she, too, is understandably devastated, because what they all believed about Pat turned out to be wrong, and he wasn't that bad a guy after all. John explains how Pat was a very charming guy, and so people tended to do what he asked them to, resulting in many resentments. He also reveals that Charlene and Pat were never married, as Pat was not loyal to her, and was known to be reckless. Nate drives out to Meg's place to check up on her. He finds her with Jacob, the other pilot, and engages in conversation with him, inquiring about Pat. Jacob abruptly tells him that Pat got what he deserved, and leaves after giving Meg a tight hug. After he leaves, Nate asks Meg about Jacob. She shares that he was once Pat's best friend and, to her, he was like a father, and the one who taught her to fly. Nate informs her that she will get a call from the sergeant, as the case falls into the state's jurisdiction. Meg guesses that he didn't need to be there to tell her that, which means he just wanted to check up on her. She calls him sweet for worrying about her. He asks her about the day he left, and she shares what she remembers about him, being in bed when he came over to say goodbye, his cold cheek. She becomes emotional thinking about him, and Nate apologizes. She voices her thoughts on how he should be handling the case, and not the state police, but he declines, citing that the reason for leaving Boston was to get away from such cases. Meg realizes he will not share and instead seduces him. Yes, she goes ahead and seduces him, and they make love. That night, Max is working late at his desk when someone walks in. Max cries and blames the other person for lying to him about Pat being an accident. The person shoots him. The next day, Meg arrives at the lunatic and finds his body. Nate and Deputy Otto collect evidence and discover a typed note on his computer, in which Max takes responsibility for Pat's murder. Otto goes to inform the state police about it, while Nate speaks to Max's wife. He directly asks her if she thinks Max had a reason to end Pat, a rather direct approach, but a perfect policing technique, just straight up asking the widow if she thinks her husband was a murderer. Anyway, it hurts her, but she denies the accusation. When she sees the note, she calls it a lie. Meg, who is comforting her, gets upset with Nate for being so heartless. When they are alone, she lashes out at him, sharing how Max taught her to dance when she was little and played games with her, and he would never do something like that. Nate defends himself by sharing how he understands loss, but when she mentions his partner, he closes off, much to Meg's ire. Just then, he gets a call and is saved by the bell. It's the sergeant. calling to inquire about what to do with Pat's body. Nate informs Meg of the same, and she walks away to speak to Charlene. Ed walks in just then and starts pestering Nate about his stolen fishing gear. Frustrated due to the fight with Meg and Ed's unreasonable demand, Nate yells at him about caring more for petty theft and not about his passed-on friend. However, he realizes his mistake the minute he sees Ed's face go white upon learning about Max's passing. On the other side, Charlene and Meg discuss how they both find it unbelievable that Max was involved in hurting Pat. Charlene shares that she always assumed Pat was in Anchorage, because that's where he had gone after they fought. They finally have a heart-to-heart conversation about their issues. Meg shares how she felt like Charlene was rejecting her, and Charlene explains that she thought Pat had rejected her, so she slept around, never wanting to trust another man. Charlene points out to Meg that she avoids men altogether for the same reason. Meg does not like hearing her mom's accurate analysis and walks away. However, Charlene stops her and suggests that they should cremate him. The next day, Nate drives to Meg's to give her Pat's effects, including his diary, that mentions 2 other people on the mountain with him. He explains that the case was closed by the state after Max's note. Meg gets upset and angry at him for accepting that and not fighting for justice. She asks him to consider what he would do if he were investigating it. Nate refuses at first, but when she requests it of him, he shares his doubts about Max's and how he feels they both were murdered by the same person, who is still in lunacy. The next day, Nate is called up by Ed to Bing's truck, where they find his fishing gear. Ed wants Nate to arrest him, and Nate does so initially, as Bing pulls out his rifle. However, they soon realize he was just disarming it, so Nate lets him off with a fine, which annoys Ed. Ed promises to make him regret it. Nate and Meg go through old photos at her place, trying to find a connection between Pat and Max's murder. Meg gives him all the information she has on the people they know from town. A montage shows what they are currently up to. Meg becomes upset, realizing that one of the people she considered family murdered her father and Max. She also shares that her father was in Anchorage, so he must have had someone fly them up to the mountain before climbing. Nate mentions Jacob, but she dismisses it, citing that she trusts him. Nate asks her if she could guess why her father went to Anchorage. She shares that he used to gamble, and maybe that's why he went there. Meg regrets blaming Charlene for Pat leaving. Nate comments on the uselessness of assigning blame. Meg asks him about what happened back in Boston. Nate tries to deflect, but she gets angry at him for hiding his pain. She walks away in anger, goes outside and reads Pat's journal, where he mentions missing Meg. Nate finally gathers the courage and shares his past story with her. He reveals that his ex-wife cheated on him, and when he found out, he went out to get drunk. His partner accompanied him at his request. At the bar, they came across a deal going on in the back alley, and they tried to intervene. The culprit shot them both. Nate's partner was fatally wounded, and Nate was also hospitalized. He shares that he could not stay there knowing he was responsible for his friend's passing, as he insisted that they go out drinking. He also shares that he never even returned his partner's wife's calls, as he did not have the courage to face her after destroying her life. Meg tries to tell him that he cannot choose to live a life like that, guilt-ridden. They make love and have dinner in bed, while someone keeps an eye on them from outside. The next day, as Nate leaves, they find footsteps in the snow leading to their bedroom window. Annoyed and angry, Nate decides to start reinvestigating the case. He begins by asking questions of everyone in town, offending most, including the mayor, Ed, and Bing. When he speaks to John, John feels disturbed by all the questions, as Nate finds out that he left the town right around the time Pat went missing. The next morning he meets Jacob at the inn, and asks him if he knows who flew Pat up the mountain. Jacob promises to find out, but when Nate asks him more questions, Jacob warns him off. Later, Meg and Nate go out for a movie date. As they leave the theater, they see a commotion. Nate steps up to investigate, and discovers that someone has stabbed Thompson's dog Luke. Nate spots John leaving the scene and wonders about it. He finds Ed's missing gloves, and his hunting knife covered in blood near the dog. Ed tries to blame Bing, thinking he stole his gear, but Nate informs him that he is still investigating it. The next day, Charlene and Meg disperse Pat's ashes over the river. They finally reconcile, and talk about how much Charlene is in love with Pat. Meg shares a story about Pat, and they bond over it, saying their goodbyes. Meg leaves the next day, asking Nate to take care of Rocky. Nate tries to feed him, while Rocky growls at him. Jacob visits during that time and informs him about the pilot who flew Pat that night, also mentioning that he won $25,000 at poker the same night. Nate guesses that whoever murdered him took the money, and paid Max to keep it quiet. He asks Ed and Mayor Hop about the money, and that's when Mayor Hop informs him that John is leaving. Nate goes to John's place and finds out that his home is full of Charlene's pictures. When he questions John about it, John lashes out at him, explaining that he knows she would never accept him, and so now he has finally decided to leave, because it's too late. Listening to John, Nate finally calls his partner's wife. They talk, and she calls him an idiot for taking all the blame, asking him to come back home to Boston. In Meg's absence, Nate finally starts making headway with Rocky. Rocky and Nate are getting chummy when Meg returns. She is surprised that they are so close. Nate hugs her tightly. She surprises him with a new pair of snow boots. Nate is excited to receive them and comments that the boots mean she wants him to stay with her for a long time. Meg tries to escape, avoiding more meaningful discussion, but Nate asks her to marry him. She gets annoyed, but he pulls her around, holds her, looks into her eyes, confesses his love for her, and asks her again. Meg relents and they kiss, finally making love. Later, they hear Rocky barking furiously. Meg and Nate run outside to check on him and find him confronting a grizzly bear. They scare it away and save Rocky. Meg spots a bag of bloody meat tied to a tree branch. They realize someone had deliberately set a trap to attract the bear, and since Meg was supposed to be out of town, and everyone knew Nate was taking care of Rocky, it was likely the trap was intended for him. The next day, Meg speaks to Charlene about how she felt guilty about Pat leaving, so she always blamed Charlene for it. She also thanks Charlene for not leaving, and for giving her the town as a family. Meg shares that Nate proposed to her. Charlene is happy to hear about it, and advises her to hold on to love. Meg asks Charlene to choose the same happiness for herself, and not let John leave. Charlene goes up to Nate's room to congratulate him. As they walk down the stairs laughing, John is downstairs and hears the laughter, misunderstanding the cause. When they get down, the mayor is waiting for Nate. John walks away angrily. Charlene sees him and rushes after him. She stops him and tries to ask for some time, but John is not ready to settle, as he is unable to bear the thought of her seeing someone else while he waits. Charlene requests him to stay back, explaining that thinking of him leaving is breaking her heart. They make up as Nate and Mayor Hop watch from afar. The mayor informs Nate that there is a council meeting. At the meeting, Ed encourages others to fire Nate. Nate accepts it and leaves. Outside, the boy they saved from the mountain earlier meets him, and shares that he stole something from the cave in the mountains. He hands Nate an earring. Nate decides to hand it over to the state police, but Meg asks him to stop running. When she realizes he finally spoke to his partner's wife, meaning he is ready to move on, she confesses her love for him and asks him to stay back and fight. They start investigating again, and Nate wonders about the earring, as it seems familiar to him somehow. He remembers seeing it in a picture at John's place, and they rush over there. Nate finds the frame and shows Meg her father's murderer. The next morning, the town celebrates Founders Day. Meg, Nate, Otto, and Jacob walk down the town street, but there is a parade going on, so Nate asks everyone to wait. However, the sergeant has already called for backup. Ed, who is part of the parade, spots them, and he realizes his game is up. We are shown a flashback of Nate spotting the earring on Ed's photo in Max's office. Ed steps off the parade car and grabs Max's wife, threatening her with a gun. He asks Nate and the others to back away. Nate and Otto try to talk to him, asking him to calm down, but he does not relent. Meg gets furious and rushes toward him with her gun, threatening to shoot him if he tries to hurt Max's wife. The sergeant quietly tries to creep up behind Ed, but he spots him and shoots at him. Ed turns around and threatens to shoot Nate, taking a shot at Meg. Meg gets hurt and Nate loses his cool, taking a shot at Ed and hitting him. Otto also shoots him. They rush to Meg. She is bleeding, as the bullet grazed her arm. Later, as they walk out, Nate informs her that Ed is trying to plead self-defense, but they have videos of him shooting at Meg. Meg asks him to walk to the river with her and spend the night under the sky. Nate proposes to her again. She tries to act coy to tease him, but finally accepts it. They kiss as the northern lights light up the sky.